2 years into the war, have sanctions against Russia been effective? And at one level, you can look at it and go, well, the war's going on. So, you'd say the knee-jerk reaction is, well, no. But Daniel Dresner, who has done a lot on sanctioning, had a Substack recently where he addressed this. He said, look, this whole question is putting a false standard or a false expectation on sanctioning. That in the history of sanctioning, there are very few, if any, examples of a nation being forced to give up land that they took, land that they spent blood conquering. No one's given it up as a result of sanctions, right? That he says this is just not something that sanctions do. And he says that, look, Western policymakers, the ones that are making these decisions, they don't even think of it in that terms, right? They think of it in terms of deterrence, and obviously that did not work in this case. Although, Biden at one point said, well, sanctions don't deter. And I said, well, that's nonsense, because sanctions have deterred. And it's also hard to say, when you say, well, point to examples. I'm like, well, all the countries that don't invade other countries. Deterrence means nothing happens. So showing a case, it's hard to see, but there are some cases where we can see it. And we generally think, in general, people don't invade and they don't conquer land as much. So, on the other hand, this question of when a war's going on, what do the sanctions do? There's a thing called denial, right? Denial is the idea you deny the enemy or your opponent in a war a capacity. And this comes out from the literature on strategic bombing, right? You can punish people and try to get them to come to the table and say, oh, this war is so horrible, we don't want to go on. And the punishment strategies don't work very well. And there's a lot of skepticism on them. Denial, on the other hand, denying your opponent a capability, weakening their industrial complex, doing things that shut them off. This is considered to be easier to do with both strategic bombing and with sanctioning. And so have the sanctions against Russia diminished their capacity to wage the war? And it would be really hard to say that they haven't. It would be really hard to say that, that Russia has not been hampered in its ability to get parts and things it needs. Now, they have gone around, they haven't been completely cut off from it, but it has diminished. So in terms of effectiveness, what's your standard, right? If it makes it really hard and cuts their production in half, is that good? As opposed to, well, it's only effective if it completely shuts them down. Right? This is where I think Dresner's saying, look, we're putting these false expectations in here. Another area that sanctions could be, we could see them as being useful is norm enforcement. The idea that, look, we don't just do this for Russia. We do this for all nations to say, if you do what they are doing, we are going to stop you. And that will have a benefit elsewhere, right? And also, by the way, does Russia really want to take over? Do they really want to mess around with Moldova, right? Do you really want to expand this? But obviously for China, China is a target of this. Like, hey, do you want, if you do Taiwan or if you interfere in another nation in your area, this is what you might expect. And so that can have a benefit beyond the immediate conflict that we're talking about, right? So this is the question. And so are sanctions being effective? I'd say, yeah, as long as we understand that there's different ways they can be effective and there's different extents to which they can be effective. And if you're looking for, magic bullet, no. Useful tool, I would say yes.